Welcome again to BVC Online. I'm Pastor Paddy and it's great to have you all join us with us this morning. It's so good to know that you're out there and you're listening. And as a church, we want to pray over you this morning and just share the Word of God with you to bring you some hope in this time of trouble that's in our world right now. I'm sure for most of you, unless you've been living on another planet the last number of weeks or something like that, you are undoubtedly, you all know about what's going on in our country right now. It doesn't seem that long ago. I mean, it's not that many weeks ago when all of us were getting on with our routine lives in whatever way they were, whether they were good, bad. It was just a normal everyday for most of us. But that was yesterday. This is today. We're in a totally different situation today. And the thing about it, that it just seems so different. Today is very, very different to what it was just a couple of weeks ago. All I can say is that for me, and I'm sure you feel the same, there's so much fear out there that you can sense it in the atmosphere. It's out there and you can feel it. There's anxiety, there's tension, and people are just scared. No matter what way we put on our brave faces, people are scared. You know, the thing about the COVID virus that most of us know is that it's not just as simple as how it affects people's health, although that's important. But it's the knock-on thing that leaves us wondering, what about the economy? What about the jobs and everything else that people are losing at the moment in time? And, you know, most of us have no idea what's going on right now. And it leaves us feeling we don't know what tomorrow will bring and how we should feel about it. And it's the uncertainty that troubles most of us, you know, because it leaves us with the big question, how did it all happen so quickly? Just a few weeks ago, like I said, all of us were aware of it, but all of a sudden it's here on our doorstep and we're living in different times. In fact, it's difficult to know that we're now living in a time when our country is as close to lockdown as it possibly could be. You see, there's no doubt in my mind when I think about it, we're living in what I'm going to call this morning the time between. And what I mean by that is there was yesterday and how things were and what tomorrow might bring. And now we're living in the here and now, which is a totally different time with a totally different feel about it. What occurred to me when I've been thinking about these things was that many, many years ago, the disciples and followers of Jesus were living in what I would call, again, that time between. On that famous Easter weekend, all of those years ago, there was a similar situation. And that's the one good thing when we look at what the Bible, if you're a Christian, what does the Bible have to say to you and how does it speak into it at a time like this? If you're not a Christian, the Bible still speaks into these situations. And most of you probably know, and you've probably heard of the Good Friday story and the Easter Sunday story when you think back of Easter weekend all those years ago. But the thing is, whoever talks about that day between, the Saturday that most people never refer to, and what I mean is just to ask ourselves the questions, how are the followers of Jesus responding? How are they feeling on the Saturday? You see, just yesterday for them, which was the Friday, there was the frightening events which took place. Earlier in the week, everything seemed so good. Suddenly, Thursday night, Jesus is arrested. And on Friday, many of them witnessed his crucifixion and that horrible death that he faced. Saturday was the aftershock. It was like as though they were living through the consequences of it all. And for them, what we know, they didn't know. It's that Sunday was in the future and it wasn't yet written. You see, unlike us, they didn't have the benefit of a scriptures, a Bible, or anything else. Sunday was not yet written for them. We've got it. We can look back at it, but they didn't. You see, Jesus, they're in their world, possibly everything they knew and came to believe and understood, it was all gone to pieces. The certainty that they had, their world had crumbled. You see, Jesus, the man that they placed their faith in, was gone. And to all intents and purposes to them, he was dead. And that was the end of the story. You see, none of this as they understood it, was in the script. At least not the script that they had. Now try to think about it. These people had followed Jesus everywhere for about 3 years or so. They ate with him. They listened to him. They witnessed every miracle he performed. They understood. They were part of what must have been one of the most amazing experiences that any one of us can go through. We can be sure from what we read in the Gospels that their hearts were so caught up with this man Jesus that they were sold on him, so to speak. We find that people like Andrew, Peter, James, John, Matthew, and many others, they left their jobs, they left their businesses, they left it all behind them to go follow this man called Jesus. You see, the thing is, this wasn't a men-only club. It's written in the Gospels that there was many women who followed him too. Some were named and they were credited by the writer of one of the Gospels called Luke, and he told us that they were the source of funding. He says in Luke chapter 8 and verses 2 and 3, he says there was women came who followed Jesus. They were cured of evil spirits and diseases. Mary Magdalene was one of them, from whom 7 demons had come out. Joanna, the wife of Chusa, and the manager of Herod's household, Susanna, and many others had followed him. These women were helping to support them out of their own means. So it wasn't just the guys, it was the women as well. But suddenly all of these people, the world that they knew yesterday was turned upside down. And I think it's not too difficult to even get our minds around the fact that some of these people maybe hadn't even slept since that Thursday night because of the traumatic experiences of the last few days. They were probably physically and emotionally exhausted. Maybe they were even frightened. I'm sure it was safe to say they were frightened at what had taken place. You see, in the time between, there can be confusion, there can be uncertainty. You don't know why these things have happened. You don't know what's going on. You don't know what's going to happen next, whether they're going to come after you or not. You see, there's one thing we do know, that all we need is just one day. Just one day gives you plenty of time to think about yesterday, doesn't it? To talk about it, to think about it, and sometimes maybe even to get depressed about it. You see, when we read Luke's Gospel again, chapter 24 and verse 17, it talks about 2 of the disciples that walked on a road from Jerusalem to a place called Emmaus. And it actually tells us they were downcast. Their expressions were downcast because they had hoped. But it seemed that all of that hope that they placed their trust in was gone. At least that's the way they felt. In the time between, Peter, the apostle, had probably lots of time to think and regret the denials of Jesus. What about somebody like Thomas? Thomas was probably someone who made up his mind that he was never going to believe anything again unless he had absolute proof. There was times in the in-between when it's easy to lose sight of where we're going, to become confused, to become depressed, to become introverted and self-absorbed. In the time between, it can be so easy to feel that God has somehow just disappeared out of your life. He's vanished. He's nowhere to be seen. You feel abandoned. You feel He's let you down. And you feel you're on your own. And somehow He's distant and He's silent. That's how you feel. And you find the more you ask questions, the more you just feel a silence and that you're on your own. You see, from this perspective, when we look back at it, we could probably say a whole lot of things to those disciples, to the apostles all those years ago. You see, from our vantage point, it might be very easy to be critical of them. We could remind them of everything that Jesus had said, everything they had witnessed, everything the books of the Bible had written about Jesus. And you might say to them, didn't you know? Didn't you understand? Hadn't you got Jesus with you? You see, 3 times Jesus told them about his death, but it's like as though they didn't hear. And Peter, we could go to him and say, why did you pretend you didn't know him? Why did you pretend you had no idea who he was? And Thomas, why were you looking for proof? Why did you need proof? Wasn't Jesus himself enough proof for you? It's funny, isn't it? Something tells me that in the time between, on that Saturday, all of those disciples probably had enough time of their own to be thinking through all of these things for themselves with their own form of regrets, their own form of whatever it might have been. But you see, they were living in a reality that was present to them. They didn't have tomorrow as we see it from this side of the fence. See, the time between doesn't give us an aerial view of the big picture. It doesn't show us what's going to happen tomorrow. We can only see what was yesterday and what suddenly today holds for us. You see, when we look back on the written scriptures, on the written gospels, we know that on the Sunday the stone was rolled away and Jesus Christ himself was risen from the dead. We know that. We know he rose. We know that the scriptures tells us just a couple of chapters later that he appeared to them in a room that day, and it's written in John's Gospel chapter 20. But you see, it's interesting to note that it tells us that not all of the disciples were present that day. There was one of them missing. And that one was called Thomas. Now, there could have been lots of reasons why he wasn't there that day. We don't know what they are. Maybe he felt there was no point in being there. Maybe he was disillusioned and just upset or disappointed or feeling, why should he be there? This was all meaningless to gather anymore because Jesus was gone in his eyes. You see, the thing about Thomas was interesting is that when you're caught up in the time between, caught up in the present situation, us in our present situation, our disappointments and problems, there's that tendency when we're in these situations to make foolish and bad choices. You see, in the time between, these choices and decisions, they can seem very good to us. They can seem the best choices. They can seem like they're very clever choices. And we make these choices and decisions because they believe they're in our best interests. We believe that they will get us through. But I think many of us will admit that we've often made choices that only made things worse. Haven't we? Very often the choices we make, no matter how clever they might seem at the time, just don't work out quite as well as we would like. See, as simplistic as it might sound, Thomas made what would be a foolish choice not to join with the other disciples that morning. Now again, we don't know why. Maybe he made that decision on the Saturday. I don't know. But whatever reason and for whatever purpose it was, here's the thing, that he actually missed an encounter with the risen Lord Jesus Christ that day by the choice he made, for whatever reason. See, many of us, when we're feeling down, when we're feeling troubled, disappointed, or to use the cliche, going through a hard time, when we're in uncertain times, we make choices that can be very, very often a bad choice. A choice that causes us to miss out on an opportunity to encounter God in our situation. It can be a bad choice we make because it gives us possibly one more week to brood and to let that problem go deeper and deeper into our souls, and only encourages us to make more bad choices, to make bad choices that we've already made even worse still. See, the easiest thing to believe in the present reality is how it feels to us. And so according to how we feel, we make decisions. You see, tomorrow, for many of us, hasn't been written yet. You can't see it, you can't hold it, you can't even grasp it. None of us can. Because we're living in a present reality that I call the time between. Let's go back to Thomas for a moment, and we discover when we read the Gospels that at some point he actually met with the lads. He met with them. And can you imagine it? Just imagine that moment when Thomas walks in, they meet him, and they actually say to him, "We have seen Jesus. We met with him, and he's alive." Can you imagine Thomas? You can almost imagine him saying, "You can believe that if you want, but without substantial proof, I'm not going to believe it. You can believe that if you want." You see, suddenly Thomas is an atheist. Now, I didn't say he lost his religion. I just said he was practicing in a way that he didn't believe it anymore. He was probably the first Christian atheist, so to speak. And you know what's interesting? Churches are often very full of atheists. Now, what do I mean by that? You see, here's the thing. Churches have lots of people who come in, and the way we live and we behave, we acknowledge Christ, but our behavior says we don't believe it. We don't practice it. We almost need very definite, definitive proof before we believe anything, in spite of what we say. But because we're living in the time between, we might feel we're in the reality of how we are and how we feel right now. You know those times when you feel you're in a bad place right now? Maybe you're feeling the inner weight of condemnation, failures, those feelings of guilt and hypocrisy, things you should have done, things you'd like to have done, you'd hoped to do, and all of that kind of stuff. And now you're wondering why you didn't, and you're feeling at this moment in time that when things were good, you should have done so much more, but you didn't. And now you're in the time between, the present reality, when all the uncertainties are gathering around you with everything else that's locked up in you, making you wonder, just what a mess I am. See, the thing is, some of us go around feeling that I can never be good enough. No matter what I do, I always seem to mess it up. But when we go back to the Gospels and what's written, especially in John's Gospel, you find that when we move into chapter 20 of John's Gospel, you realize at this point in time, we were now in that Sunday equation, and even the days and weeks after it, and the apostles, the disciples, were meeting with him from time to time. And they were back, so it was going to church, we may as well say. But yet there's that strange feeling that things are not quite the same, they're not quite right. And the story continues back into chapter 21 rather, where we find there was Peter. There was Thomas, Nathaniel, James and John, who along with two others one day were wondering, what will I do with myself? And in the middle of their conversation, they were probably in lockdown, like many of us are in lockdown, for different reasons, of course. But they were probably trying to find out what they will do on this boring day. And Peter came up with this idea, let's go fishing, guys. And we find in John's Gospel, chapter 21 and verse 1, that where were they? Where was it they were going fishing that day? It was at the Sea of Galilee. That's interesting, isn't it? So they went. They went out to fish, and it was just like old times. They spent the night fishing and caught nothing. Now, sometimes that's what it can be like in our old lives, the lives we once had, our yesterdays and all that. No matter how attractive it might seem, sometimes it feels that we're doing all sorts of things, working for all sorts of things. We're busy with all of work, life, trying to get on and accomplishing nothing. We just feel we're running around and accomplishing nothing. Like Peter and the lads, they're fishing all night, catching nothing. You see, why do we go back there when things go wrong? You know what? And at sunrise that day, according to the Gospels, it tells us there was Jesus standing on the shoreline. Now, it wasn't too many years earlier that Jesus stood on that same Sea of Galilee. And it's where he met Peter and the others for the first time. You see, that night they fished all night too and caught nothing. I wonder if Peter remembered that day when they caught nothing. And on that same day too, Jesus gave them instructions to put out their nets. And they caught as many fish as they could get into the boats that day because they had encountered Jesus. See, it was on that day of the first meeting that Peter made the declaration to Jesus, "Go away from me, Lord, I am a sinful man." Peter, on his first encounter with Jesus, recognized just who he was in the present reality. "I'm a sinful man. I don't deserve to have you near me, Jesus." Yet on that same day, Jesus says to a sinful man, come and follow me. Isn't that something else? Peter didn't have to be totally ready. Peter didn't have to get over all of the things. His confession alone of "I am a sinful man" was ready enough when Jesus says, "Come, follow me." But now in the present context, it's another encounter with Jesus, another night, as it were, wasted following around and trying to catch fish that you can't catch. And there on the shoreline that day is Jesus. And you know what? In spite of how Peter must have felt the guilt of his denials and all of the rest of it, what you see when you read the Gospel of John is that Jesus on the shoreline didn't have a notebook full of everything that Peter didn't do and where he failed or where any of the others failed. What he did have was breakfast being cooked for them. Not a hint of condemnation. There was no, what are you doing here fishing when you're supposed to be out doing everything else? There was nothing like that. Instead, he invited them to come join him for breakfast. That's an incredible thing, because the Jesus of the Bible always invites us to come join him. Sit down and have breakfast with me. You see, before there came the time to restore them to where they ought to be, in spite of everything what was happening and all that was going on, all of the failings and everything, there was that one question that Jesus had: do you love me, Peter? See, none of us are perfect. I'm not perfect. None of them were perfect. The disciples weren't perfect. But there's still that question, in spite of where you're at, do you love me? And the response of Peter was yes. And the call of Jesus was to say, well, follow me. See, sometimes we need to see him in the time between, simply because tomorrow is not yet written. But there he is. Here he is. He's not condemning us. He is offering to give us hope. He's offering to share himself with us. He wants us to sit down and have breakfast, so to speak, with him, to encounter him, wanting to restore you, to pick it up, to follow him.